Hey loves, welcome or welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Faith, and today guys, I'll be checking out this interesting video from Thomas Sowell, and it's titled The Surprising Truth Behind the Disunity Among Indians. You guys, I'm super excited as always. If you're yet to subscribe to this channel, please consider subscribing. Give this video a massive thumbs up, comment, share, and all that good stuff. And without much ado, let's see what Thomas Sowell has for us in this video.
The various indigenous peoples fought among themselves for access to European trading posts, where beaver furs could be traded for goods from across the Atlantic. Among these goods, perhaps the most fateful were guns and liquor. Those Indians immediately in contact with Europeans fought off other Indians trying to reach them, so that most of the furs traded to Europeans came from Indians who had not themselves trapped the animals, but who had acquired their pelts in trade from other Indians farther away, in exchange for European goods supplied by the Indian middlemen, who made a profit on both exchanges. Thus the Cree Indians on the shores of Hudson's Bay became middlemen in the fur trade, and the Iroquois, who dominated the region between the Alleghenies and the Great Lakes, cut off the Ottawas and the Hurons from Quebec and Montreal.
Interesting.
In order to get around the Iroquois, the French ventured farther west. More than trade alone was involved. Because access to Europeans meant access to European firearms, this caused a shift in the military balance of power among Indians. The Cree Indians, for example, acquired more than 10,000 firearms from the Hudson Bay Company between 1670 and 1689, not counting the additional firearms they were getting in trade with the French.
Wow.
Those Indians in direct contact with white settlements could acquire enough firearms to shift the military balance of power against rival tribes and nations, whom they accordingly barred from having the same direct contact. Thus the Ojibwa not only acquired guns, but strove to drive the Sioux and the Fox tribes away from the Great Lakes, where they too might have acquired guns.
Oh my gosh.
These guns could of course also be used against the white settlers, and often were. But a limiting factor for the Indians was that they needed the settlers not only to supply firearms, but also to repair them and to supply ammunition. In an outbreak of warfare between Indians and whites in 17th century Massachusetts, for example, the Indians won more battles, but the whites won the war when the Indians' ammunition began to run out. In general, warfare between whites and Indians was less common during the colonial era than warfare among the Indians, fighting with one another for access to European settlements.
This is serious.
Indian tribes or nations, determined to break through rival tribes or nations who held them at bay from the European trading posts, launched attacks and invasions to gain the coveted access. The Hurons held annual meetings with other local Indians, warning them not to attempt to make direct contact with the French.
Wow.
Later, the Iroquois decimated the Hurons, forcing their remnants westward while absorbing some of the survivors into the Iroquois Confederation. Meanwhile, the Europeans sought better access to the Indian suppliers of pelts without having to go through middlemen. Many of the explorations of the British and the French were for the purpose of finding water routes taking them further inland to the Indians who were the original trappers, where trades could be made without paying the middleman's profit. Isolated European traders, more noted for their courage than their scruples, often penetrated deeper into Indian territory.
Wow, you guys, this is a very interesting one from Thomas Sowell, and I love the way he explained everything in a very simple term. And what I can deduce from what Thomas Sowell has said so far is that all of this disunity among the Indians all boils down to business and who gets access to the white man for, and not letting other Indians get access to what they are having already. This is very, very typical in most parts of the world, not only Indians, because people are so greedy that wherever they are benefiting from, they don't want others to benefit from there. Let me know what you guys think about this video. I love how Thomas Sowell explained everything in this video, and you guys, let's continue watching.
In search of better trading terms and bigger profits. Here and there, organized settlements of whites in colonial North America were able to raid or invade local Indians' territory, but usually there was no need to risk such trials of arms. Moreover, the European settlers were as anxious for the furs traded by the Indians as the Indians were for European goods. Over time, however, as the beavers began to be hunted to extinction in the eastern regions of North America, the fur trade moved west to find new beaver populations. Those Indians who had abandoned their traditional means of livelihood in favor of trade with the European settlers were left in a particularly difficult position after the loss of both hunting opportunities and of their traditional artisan skills. Where there was no such economic interdependence, as in colonial Virginia, where tobacco rather than fur was the great export, military hostilities between whites and Indians developed early on. While the first James River settlers readily traded copper for food, escalating corn prices led to forcible seizures of Indian corn and cornfields by the whites, initiating a series of wars in which hundreds were killed on each side. Unlike furs, which white settlers obtained in trade with the Indians, tobacco was grown by the colonists themselves. Although the original settlers were outnumbered by the Powhatan Indians by well over 100 to 1 in the early 17th century, the rapidly growing white population of Virginia was by 1675 more than 10 times the size of the Indian population. While Europeans ultimately prevailed militarily in both North and South America, this was a much more protracted process in the United States and Canada than in Latin America. Moreover, the nature of the Europeans' hegemony differed as between the Iberians, on the one hand, and the British, French, and Americans on the other. In particular, the colonies of transplanted British and French communities in North America remained a largely insular world of their own, with Europeans living in European communities and Indians living in Indian communities, however much the boundaries between the two might move over the years, and however much interaction there might be in the frontier zones between the two. Seldom was there a situation such as that in Spanish America, where a European overlord class lived directly off the work of the indigenous peoples living in European-controlled territory. The exchange of Indian land for European goods was seldom an individual transaction. That is, individual white settlers did not usually buy land from individual Indians and go live in the midst of Indian communities. Rather, officials of the colonial settler governments purchased large tracts of land from Indian tribes and then subdivided it among individual white purchasers. Indeed, all colonial governments at one time or another banned individual land purchases from individual Indians because of the legal and other complications this could cause. Even after the white population grew larger and more powerful in colonial North America, expansion into Indian territory seldom took the classic form of...
You guys, I'm having fun reacting to Thomas Sowell. This is a very interesting piece of history, and I believe you guys are also having a good time with this particular wall. Let me know what your thoughts are about this video so far. Thomas Sowell is a very, very intelligent, and the way he teaches is very, very understandable. I'm enjoying every minute of this video, and you guys, let's wrap this video up.
Form of conquest of one sovereign nation by another. The drive for expansion into Indian lands was often led by freelance adventurers rather than by government military forces. Under frontier conditions, even governments on the scene had only limited control of all the people nominally under their authority. As late as 1792, Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter, "I hope, too, that your admonitions against encroachments on the Indian lands will have a beneficial effect. The U.S. finds an Indian war too serious a thing to risk incurring one merely to gratify a few intruders with settlements, which are to cost the other inhabitants of the U.S. 1,000 times their value in taxes for carrying on the war they produce. I am satisfied it will ever be preferred to send armed force and make war against the intruders as being more just and less expensive." Control on the Indian side was not necessarily any more effective, in part because many North American Indians did not have the kind of governmental structures to control their own people that Europeans did. Chiefs selected to lead hunts or to lead wars had no permanent power to impose their will on the whole society. When Indian braves saw their lands invaded by whites, they could strike back and thereby unleash a war between the races, regardless of what more cautious advice might be given them by their elders. Under these circumstances of uncontrollable groups on both sides, outbreaks of frontier warfare between Europeans and Indians did not always depend on decisions made by leaders on either side. The French had a somewhat similar problem with individual entrepreneurs in the fur trade, who in effect extended the European settlements beyond bounds considered militarily defensible. In general, the expansion of the white settlers into Indian territory in North America was directed primarily toward taking over the land itself, rather than acquiring Indians as subjects of the government or as vassals of white landowners or of European ecclesiastical establishments, as happened in much of Spanish America. One consequence of this difference was that Indian and European races were much less mixed in British North America than in Spanish America, where a substantial part of the entire population was of mixed blood after 3 centuries of rule by the Spaniards. Because the advancing Europeans did not generally acquire sovereignty over the Indians living on the invaded territories, the Indians forced off these lands retreated to new lands, where their sovereignty remained more or less intact. Thus, a century after the United States was formed, there were still Indian nations capable of fighting the U.S. Army and of defeating Custer at the Little Bighorn. Only after the American nation spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific was federal sovereignty imposed on Indians still living in their own enclaves.
Wow, you guys, that was such an interesting one from Thomas Sowell. I really love how easy it was to understand what Thomas Sowell was talking about in this video. It was very, very educating, and I learned a thing or two from here. Let me know your thoughts on this particular one. If you have a thing to add to what Thomas Sowell has said so far in this video, please leave it in the comment section down below. And I will see you all in my next video. Bye, guys.